I'm Scott Lucas. This is Deep Dive Politics World Unfiltered in partnership with Dactylo 1984. Welcome back, everybody. It's season 2 of Deep Dive Politics World Unfiltered. We're quite excited. In season 1, we made our way from Armenia and Azerbaijan to Russia, to China, to the United States, and paid a bit of attention to Turkey as well. But in that pilot season, it was a bit of an adventure, sort of like the adventure we've all been living in for the past couple of years around the world. For season 2, however, the adventure's moved on. I'm so pleased to announce that Dactylo 1984, their analysts, their activists, well, they've joined up with us. So you may notice a difference in format already. Rather than me talking one-on-one with folks, I've brought together an esteemed panel. And what are we talking about? Well, you just might have noticed over the past few days, even if you're in the Brexit backwater of the UK, maybe even the US, there's a thing called the Turkish lira, which hasn't been doing too well. In one day, it lost 10% of its value. In the past 2 weeks, it's lost 20%. And there's a political side to that as well. Supposedly, the Erdogan government had been saved because the UAE came in earlier this week, bringing $10 billion, and the lira improved by several percent. Guess what? By the end of the week, it's lost all of the gain. So we've got a bit of an economic situation here, but it's not just an economic situation. Any economic situation in Turkey has to be connected to a political situation around a leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has been at the head of the Turkish system for 20 years. And indeed, it has to be tied to social issues, issues such as the Kurdish population, issues such as Erdogan's, well, let's say, increasing control of his party, and some would say his country. Are we at a point where we could be seeing a fundamental change in Turkey and that Erdogan might depart? Or is this just a case that he'll be presiding over, perpetual crisis for the next few years as well? In season 1 of World Unfiltered, we actually talked about this. And I'd like to welcome back a couple of people who helped us through that. Berk Özpek and I talked about political crisis in March of last year in Turkey. I'm not sure we answered anything. But welcome back, Berk, to see if we can solve it this time around. Berk Esen did a snapshot for Deep Dive Politics about democratic backsliding, something that we may ask him about whether that's still relevant to talk about, even as we have seen protest, small protest, but still protest in Turkish cities this week. Protest over women's rights, as well as over the economy. And joining us for the first time, Özge Öner from Cambridge. She is in the Department of Economics, specifically Department of Land Economy. And she's going to bring us our expertise, which may bring, let's say, some geographical and physical considerations to what's happening as well. Just a quick reminder and a shout out to the good folks so that we don't leave anything out. Berk Esen joins us from the IPC Stiftung Mercator Fellow at the Center for Applied Turkish Studies at the German Institute for International Security Affairs, a distinguished title, which is why it took me so long to pronounce it. And then Berk Özpek again joins us. He is Associate Professor from the Department of Political Science and International Relations at TOBB University. Forgive me, I always tell you in English rather than Turkish. He's in Economics and Technology at Ankara. All right, folks, I bigged you up a lot now. So now we've got an audience coming in this premiere for season 2. And I'm going to start off for a question where each of you can jump in, although I'm going to go to Özge first, since she's joining us for the first time. So look, someone comes to you like me, doesn't know that much about Turkey, but all of a sudden reads a headline. That's it. The currency's collapsing. The banks might be shutting. How did Turkey get here? Why are we in a position of economic crisis?
So, Scott, do you want the long story or the short story or the very short story of deep dive of Turkish lira, so to say?
I'm gonna go for short, because then we're going to get Berk and Berk to come in and make it longer. Yeah.
The very short story is abdication of reason, basically. So Turkey's currency crisis that we're observing right now is a textbook example of what not to do with interest rates. Anyone who has taken Econ 101 would know that the situation we are in right now was very predictable. It is not an error of monetary policy necessarily, since it's been followed in a very consistent fashion. And the idea here is quite unorthodox, to the extent that Erdogan has the strong conviction that, in his words, interest rates are the mother and father of all evil, basically, and that high interest rates are the cause, basically. A high interest rate is what causes high inflation, which is exactly the opposite of what you would see in a standard econ textbook, and proven by a mountain of empirical evidence around the world, so to say. By reducing the independence of central bank, removing governor after governor, I mean, just to give you an idea, over the past year and a half, just 3 governors of central bank were sacked because of this unorthodox belief that basically high interest rates cause inflation instead of controlling it. So that they've been following this policy for a while, and the devaluation of Turkish lira, the depreciation of the currency has been going on for almost 10 years now. So it's not a recent phenomenon. It's the extent of it, it's the magnitude of it that is rather recent. As you mentioned also, that over one day, we have observed last Tuesday alone almost 50% depreciation. Over the entire week, it was near 20%. But actually, if you look at the slightly longer run trends, since 2017, lira lost its value against US dollars up to 50%. So it's been going on for a while. So this is not some hiccup in monetary policy. It's not some error. It's not some short run consideration or rather a short-run sacrifice of price stability to boost economic growth. This has been a consistent policy of Erdogan's government for quite some time. It's only that now we reached a point where it cannot be tolerated anymore, even the price levels, basically.
Is there, Özge, is there any economic case to be made for this lowering of interest rates? For example, arguing that it would stimulate exports because of the depreciation of the Turkish currency. That, in other words, you just sort of, you give up a bit on the lira, but you stimulate exports to kind of boost the economy coming out of a pandemic.
So, I mean, this is what they argue, right? This is the only explanation that comes from that corner of Erdogan, basically, that this is going to create jobs, boost the economy. It's going to be so cheap to export, so that there's going to be an increased demand. There's going to be an expansion in economy by way of exports. And it is true that in certain situations, and this is not only Turkey, but in certain situations, lowering the interest rate to stimulate the economy has been a policy that's been followed here and there, but not as a consistent monetary policy, basically. So this is a very short-run response to just stimulate the economy for a very, very short period of time. And then you need to have a plan for the longer run, how to get out of it. If this becomes a rather cyclical matter, then you can have a vicious cycle where you can no longer control the depreciation in the currency, which is what we are experiencing right now. So no monetary policy can actually immediately stop or cool off the exchange rate because it's been going on for so long. So this is a very unique thing we are observing, and the economic explanation doesn't cut it. What you have here is some declaration of economic war of independence. That's the narrative that he uses for while lira is basically plunging day after day. There's all sorts of arguments around how interest rate is something we need to fight against. There's some support he receives, obviously, from some Muslim countries. For example, very recently, the Oman Grand Mufti has hailed Erdogan for slashing the interest rates. That encouraged other Muslim countries to sort of follow the suit, right? And the idea here is that if enough countries do this, maybe there's going to be some structural financial change of some sort that you can observe in the global scale, which is obviously again a bit of an abdication of reason, if to say the least.
Thank you. Before we proceed, just each of you, we don't have to be completely formal. If you want to jump in at any point, throw a hand up, right? If you have points that you think you want to intersect off of it. But for the moment, Berk, let me go to you, either Berk or Berk. First one in. Do you also see this as a case of political manipulation rather than one of economic management or mismanagement? And if that's the case, what's the manipulation that's going on here? Berk, I think your microphone's
yeah. I think this is an economic crisis, but there is another crisis which is deeper than economic crisis. Okay. So we have a state crisis in Turkey, and this crisis asserts itself through economy, through foreign policy, through social issues, through other kind of political issues. So we have a fundamental crisis in Turkey, which is related to the mentality of ruling the state. I think Erdogan has serious problems with modern state, and he has serious problems with modern concepts of political science. So that is the problem. That is the problem. And now we have an economic problem. If you look at football, we have another crisis in football, for example. We have another crisis in foreign policy. We have another crisis in academia. That's all because Erdogan has serious problems with modern institutions. And I think, yes, we are having an economic problem. We are having an economic crisis, but this is not because of the mismanagement of economy. This is because of the problems of Erdogan with modern state. By that I mean, we can use the Weberian concept of modern state in order to explain why Turkey failed to manage the economy. In a Weberian state, we assume that a neutral bureaucracy, serves the interest of collective utility. So that the bureaucrats are, supposed to serve the whole nation for the benefit of nation, and their, duties are determined by the law. So it's like a machine, So political intervention or personal intervention to the bureaucracy might change the nature of state and bureaucracy. That's what is happening in Turkey now. I think Erdogan and his personalistic rule is undermining the quality of state and character of state. I mean, there are two types of authority, actually. On the one hand, we have despotic power. Turkey has a despotic power. It's an authoritarian country, no doubt. But on the other hand, there is another, type of power and authority which is related to infrastructure. Infrastructural power might be available even in authoritarian countries. For example, in China, we have an infrastructural power. Russia has infrastructural power. Or Singapore is not a democratic country, but it has infrastructural power. You might be an authoritarian leader. That doesn't mean that you have to behave in a stupid way in economy. So there is no, I think people are saying that there is a correlation between autocracy and economic crisis. No, I think autocracy does not necessitate a leader to behave in a stupid way. I think this is the crisis of personalistic rule. The infrastructural power of Turkey collapsed at the end of the day. Bureaucracy was ruined by Erdogan's personalistic rule. I think that is the name of the crisis.
So in other words, Erdogan might be an effective autocrat politically, but he's an ineffective or destructive autocrat economically?
Even in the realm of politics, he is not very capable of, conducting, a policy which serves the benefit of whole nation. He's a political animal. He can, secure his power. He can eliminate the opposition circles, opposition groups, but that doesn't mean that he is very talented politician. This means that he's a despotic politician. You can eliminate or you can intimidate your rivals by using state power. That doesn't mean that you are a talented autocrat, because you are just using the force, brutal force, to intimidate the other actors. But at the end of the day, there's a cost of that. Erdogan is not successful in foreign policy, really. Erdogan is not successful in designing domestic politics as well. Look at the survey results. He is using power and power and power, but he's still losing. He should use brutal force in order to secure his position. That's not something brilliant. That's not something related to intelligence. He's just using the despotic power. That is really complex, because people think that using despotic power means that state's authority is consolidated, is strong, but using despotic power just reflects the weakness of a political leader to recruit consent of people, actually. And I think we did so many mistakes in foreign policy, in economy, in academia, and in social science. The end of the actions, repercussions of the actions can emerge in a while. Not suddenly you face the results, actually. Erdogan constructs his authority, his power, just in the time period between cause and effect, actually. 3 years ago, he did take some steps in economy. Now we are facing with the results. But during the 3 years period, he reflected himself as a successful leader, and he gained, sympathy of people. That's what he is doing. He is taking the advantage of social science, social world, actually.
That's interesting. Berk, if I might come to you. I think when we chatted last May, or when you chatted for us on Deep Dive Politics, you talked about democratic backsliding. To what extent are the causes of this economic crisis connected with an erosion of democracy, or, as Berk has explained, an erosion of the system in Turkey?
I mean, the way that I see it, that's really the fundamental reason. Because, of course, as Dr. Öner mentioned, the immediate reason for Turkey's current economic predicament is Erdogan's insistence in keeping the interest rates low, and in fact, keeping interest rates much lower than the inflation rate, which is, of course, economically, it leads to disastrous consequences. But I think the larger cause for the current economic crisis is that Erdogan has sufficient powers, as Dr. Özpek mentioned. Erdogan has sufficient powers to personally intervene, not only in the management of the Turkish economy, but also in the management of the Turkish state apparatus, in the management of Turkey's foreign policy. And basically, as Turkey's state institutions crumble, there are really no institutional checks and balances left to prevent Erdogan from committing a certain action, however disastrous those actions may be. So in the short to medium run, Erdogan has full autonomy to basically take whatever decision he likes without really paying the consequences, because of the fact that, of course, the regime has become more and more authoritarian. So ultimately, I think the main reason for our current predicament is that for quite some time now, quite possibly for over a decade, Turkish politics experienced a gradual pace of democratic backsliding, to the point that sometime around 2014, 2015, Turkish democracy broke down. And since then, Turkey has been governed by what political scientists call to be, including myself, a competitive authoritarian regime. So you have regular elections, but those elections are neither free nor fair. And increasingly so, in this political system, Erdogan has amassed or accumulated more and more powers, sidelining other state institutions, sidelining other important members of his cabinet, of his ruling party, to the point that basically you only have Erdogan and a small group of people surrounding him. We could maybe in the second or the third round, we could give some names and discuss who these officials are. But at the end of the day, Turkey is governed or run by Erdogan and a small group of cronies who encircle him, who basically end up taking decisions in order to increase their own political aspirations and careers, in order to maintain this current authoritarian system, and in order to personally enrich themselves. So I think given this autocratization process in Turkey, what we face in contemporary Turkey has far superseded what we've seen in some other populist regimes or other countries that have populist governments, such as Poland, such as India, such as Hungary, such as Trump's US. Ultimately, right, Erdogan has succeeded to such an extent that you have very limited, very few institutions left. The institutional capacity is very low, and so the public, as well as even members of Erdogan's coalition, have very little trust in the management of Turkish foreign policy, in the management of Turkish economy, in the management of Turkish academia. And it's a disastrous course because, of course, Turkey has experienced economic crises before. And one could even form some, make some parallel comparisons between, say, the 1994 economic crisis and the current one. The main difference is that in the previous economic crises, when the stock market crashed or when the Turkish lira plummeted, the government had to retract its decisions, reverse its decisions, and come up with a much more rational economic policy to basically not fight against the markets. Right now, there is really no guarantee that this will happen. So if Erdogan decides to basically increase the interest rates tomorrow, then interest rates will be increased. If he decides to lower them further, it will be lowered further, irrespective of its consequences for the Turkish electorate. That's the dilemma. That's the that's the big political problem that we face, and I think that's the reason for the surprisingly rapid plummeting of the Turkish lira, because actually the Turkish economy, relatively speaking, relative to many other developing countries, has far stronger companies, far stronger institutions than, for instance, I would trust Turkish economy over the Argentine economy, but I don't trust Erdogan more than I trust the Argentine president. And that's the problem. So this is increasingly becoming a matter of trust issue. Why is Erdogan acting in this sort of way? Because he has to protect his ruling coalition, right? So in order to survive in power, he has to continue to allocate financial resources or material resources in a partisan manner to his base, to voters on the one hand and to crony businesses on the other hand. And basically increasing interest rates would not allow him to do that. So rather than swallow the bitter pill and deal with the negative consequences of his economic actions thus far, and basically deal with those problems for the next few months, what he's doing is that he's constantly lowering the interest rates in the hope that his ruling coalition will remain intact. And in the meantime, maybe some outside money will flow into Turkey. I think it won't. This supposedly the $10 billion that Erdogan will receive or Turkey will receive from the United Arab Emirates is pocket money, as they say, as we say in Turkish. It will only, get the economy going for the next few weeks, and then we're going to go back to this current situation. So this is really a political disaster caused by a one-man personalistic authoritarian regime.
So just before we move on, you might notice that Berk Özpek may be dropping in or out. That's because we're very informal here, and he's got childcare issues. So we're going to continue. And Berk and Özge, I'm going to put this to you. Back in November, I think 2020, Erdogan did remove his son-in-law as finance minister. And some of us thought that, okay, maybe there is a check on Erdogan consolidating control, how far he turns it into a family business. Is there no element of the Turkish system that can check him now, like the business and financial community, that says this is going to be disastrous for it? Is there no one within the opposition parties that has any influence? Is there even no possibility of public protest limiting Erdogan at this point? In other words, is he actually operating as an unrestricted actor, even if the crisis worsens in the next few weeks and months?
Will I answer this question?
Yes, please.
Okay, I just joined because I think opposition doing its best because this is a survival game. There is a coalition in the opposition, and keeping the coalition in a united way is something. And last year, during the pandemic process, for example, most influential actors of opposition, the CHP and E Party, did perform well. They just talked about economics. They just addressed economic problems in the society, and they just speculated how the bureaucracy is ruled in a corrupt way. This is very tough business in Turkey, Scott, because the public debate is determined by the government, and the public debate is generally based on identity politics, the cultural war among the different cultural identity groups, or the security is a very important issue in the government's agenda. Government, accuses every kind of opposition groups of threatening the country or being a threat to national security. Isolating yourself from the agenda created by the government is something in contemporary Turkish politics. And the opposition parties did succeed to talk about economics and governance. This is something. And they managed to be together. They preserved the coalition among them. And this created, erosion in the popularity of the government because there's an alternative over there. Being an alternative is very important in Turkish politics because replacement of AK Party will be an opportunity for the center-right voters or moderate voters to leave the AK Party. They have to believe that there is an alternative over there. They have to believe that the alternative parties are very keen on ruling the country in the next period. And preserving the unity, talking about economics, talking about governance, and talking about the failures of the government, helped, the opposition parties to exert pressure over the government. This is, as I told you, a survival game, and surviving is something in Turkish politics. They managed to survive, and this created a pressure over the government parties, MHP and AK Party. Civil society is quite weak in Turkey. People are protesting the economic crisis, but it should be an organic process. There might be some left-wing groups, there might be some liberal groups, there might be some, youth organizations, but that's not important, I think. People who did vote for AK Party had to go out and they had to shout against government. This will be very influential. For example, people living in suburb areas of Istanbul have to go to streets and they have to protest government for protest to work, actually. We are university graduates. We are secular middle-class people. Of course, we will be unhappy with the ongoing situation, but our protests mean that, government can use our image to create a demon, to create an evil character, and to consolidate its position in the eye of its rural Anatolian voter base. But if we are talking about a social pressure, we should expect ordinary, organic voters of, regular voters of AK Party to protest the government.
So to what extent are you saying, in other words, you say we have to see cracks in Erdogan's base of support in his core constituency for there really to be an effective movement to limit Erdogan? Is that what we're looking at right now?
I think the Turkish politics is so colorful. First of all, we have to be familiar with the sociology of Turkey. People are not, enthusiastic to go to streets and protest the government. This is very risky business, actually, because we have a Ministry of Interior who is, very able to suppress social movements and who is very able to frame social movements as terrorist organizations. This is very risky business. Protesting the government in the streets has some costs for the people. This is not Europe. This is not Norway. If you go outside, you will have some cost on your shoulders. So people might prefer to remain in their houses, to wait until the election day, and to punish the government. That might be a very possible scenario for the future.
Okay. Let me comment this, and I'll follow up on that in just a minute about Erdogan's base of support. But let me go back to Özge and ask a question here, which is another dimension. Is there any possibility here that international financial institutions will have an effect? I mean, we've seen discontent in the international community over the lowering of interest rates. We've seen it from international business sectors. We've seen it from the guardians of financial ratings. Does that have any possibility of checking Erdogan at this point? And or is it simply that he now almost has sealed himself off from international reaction, even if that does mean further problems for the Turkish economy, including exports?
Scott, before I get to that point, how international community can respond to what's happening in Turkey, I actually want to add to some of what Dr. Esen Berk mentioned, as well as Burak has been talking about. So in a way, I agree with most of what they say, but there's one part that I find very difficult. I find very difficult to agree with, and that's the idea that this is some sort of a power grab move on AKP's part, on Erdogan's part, like sacrificing price stability or accepting high inflation for the sake of having economic growth in the short run is their way of basically coping with a decline in support. On the contrary, I think they understand very well that they passed the point where they can gain enough support to remain in power. So this is a way to capitalize on whatever time they have left by sacrificing price stability for the nation at large and sort of trying to create pockets of interests, pockets of rent, basically, within the economy for people that are close to them, for people that are in industries that are closer to political power, basically. I think it is their way of capitalizing on whatever little time they have left, in a way, because in order for Turkish lira to recover, let's assume for a second that tomorrow morning they wake up and they have this epiphany of some sort, and they start stabilizing the interest rates or raising it up as they should. It is going to take a very long time before Turkish economy can actually recover. This period may very well cover way above what we expect the elections, when we expect the elections to take place. In fact, there's an increasing pressure to have snap elections, as you may be following. Not only this demand originates from the opposition, but also among the AKP crowd, and sort of among the people that are around Erdogan. There's some discomfort with the existing situation. So what you and I understand about economics, they understand it very well too, I think, and they don't really try to control the power. Rather, they use whatever power they have. I mean, this is very speculative, obviously, to create some rent for a very small group of people in expanse of the nation at large. And the whole manipulation around central bank, for example. I mean, since early 2000s, 2001, Turkish central bank, as it is the case with most of the central banks of legitimate countries, is independent on paper. And there's a reason for that. If you let the government meddle with monetary policy, it's very difficult to reach an inflation target, obviously, because governments sometimes prefer very rapid short-run economic growth, which may lead to them sacrificing price stability in the short run. If you are going up for election every fourth year, you may not necessarily be that concerned about the long-run price stability, but what would be beneficial for you is probably the short-run growth, right? And in order to avoid that, the central banks need to be independent. And actually, there's a sufficient body of evidence, empirical evidence, that shows central bank independence can produce price stability better in the long run. So reaching an inflation target is possible when actually you have independent central banks. And they've eroded an institution, one of the oldest institutions in Turkish Republic, with an amazing stock of human capital. I mean, we're talking about really rock solid economists that know what they're doing in central bank. Were completely paralyzed. They cannot use any of the monetary tools available to them to fight back, simply because of exactly what Berk and Bilgehan says, that there's this one man who believes that the interest rates should be lower, so the interest rates will be lower. And I think this is their way of making the best out of the situation on their way out, so to say. This is my interpretation of it. Speaking of the international community, it's a very difficult scenario. I mean, Turkey, I'm not an expert in international relations, nor am I an expert in political science, obviously. So Berk and Bilgehan would be better names to comment on this, I believe. But Turkey has been holding this chip at the very least against the European Union, where we have millions and millions of refugees, and it's a gatekeeper. It's the bottleneck, so to say, that manages a crisis that was partially spilled over and created the discontent we observed in parts of Europe. So this is a cheap way for Europe to avoid further acceleration of refugee crisis. If you actually have Turkey to safeguard or act as a gatekeeper for refugees, you could potentially at least delay the long-run consequences of further discontent related to refugee crisis. So in part, Turkey had this privilege, or rather the immunity, for several years against the European community, I believe, or their criticism because of the situation with Middle East. But on top of it, I think Erdogan, for a very long time, I would say for the past 10 years or so, had this idea of an Islamic Union of some sort when it comes to monetary affairs. I mean, he's talking to a crowd that is not necessarily the international community you have in mind. The association with the Arab Emirates, for example. I mean, the kind of investment that they're planning to do, which can actually make somewhat a difference. At the very least, it can cool off the market for a short while. I would like to think that that's not going to come for free. There must be some negotiations, details of which we may not be aware of. And what kind of privileges these countries are provided with is obviously something that we will have to live and see.
Free, Berk, to jump in at any point over that, but let me ask you further whether we're in a position where Erdogan can also bolster his position or buy time, however you look at it, with these grand projects, you know, another bridge somewhere, or even the notion of the Istanbul Canal. I mean, is that having any significance? We read a lot about it in the Western press because it gets headlines here. But is this a case of reworking bread and circuses with bridges, canals, and circuses as Erdogan tries to consolidate control?
I mean, I think the Kanal Istanbul project or any other grandiose construction project is a pipe dream. And it's a pipe dream even by Erdogan's standards at this point, given the current economic situation. Erdogan can try to build bridges out of Lego pieces, but that's pretty much it. The Turkish state budget does not even have sufficient funds to undertake the payment, the interest payment and the guaranteed payment that needs to be allocated to these construction projects that have already been completed, let alone start of new ones. And I mean, regarding Özge Hoca''s comments, I mean, I think these two interpretations are not mutually exclusive. Now, these kind of authoritarian regimes, particularly personalistic authoritarian regimes, obviously award the crony businesses, and certainly Erdogan's economic policies are there, and this is something that I also try to touch upon, are there to create rent for a certain group of businesses, particularly in construction and energy and healthcare sectors, you know, low income, you know, sectors that have very little value added value. But at the same time, I think Erdogan still hopes to be able to maintain his regime. So I don't think that he has said, okay, I'm going to lose it in 6 months' time or a year's time. So let me just try to earn as much as money for my friends and then I'll be leaving. I think, you know, these kind of personalistic leaders, they engage in all sorts of heterodox policies, hoping for some kind of an economic miracle to happen. The economic miracle does not happen, but in some isolated cases, geostrategic developments or political developments give a lifeline to these regimes. And I think Erdogan has already taken advantage of such political opportunities until he got to this point, but he's running out of options. That's why I think this heterodox experiment is going to end in disaster, and I think Erdogan's time is up. But he may not necessarily know this or realize this. But going back to your initial question, Scott, the question that you posed, especially to Bilgehan, there are really very few actors left which can discipline Erdogan. Maybe part of it, going back to Özge's comments, could be international markets, right? The plummeting of lira is the international markets' response, and to a certain extent, domestic markets' response to Erdogan's very erroneous economic policies. Of course, another actor that can put an end to this experiment would be Devlet Bahçeli, right, the silent coalition partner. But I don't think that Bahçeli is unhappy with the current course, which is why he has not necessarily turned his criticisms on Erdogan's economic agenda. Another potential actor, but I don't know how strong they are at this point, is TOB, is the Union of Chambers and I think commodity exchanges would be the exact English translation. They're basically, this is a union of tens of thousands of small businesses, which have for years now supported Erdogan and his party, and of course remain as the main economic base of AKP. And of course, these policies are hurting them as well. And if they openly criticize Erdogan, we may see at some inflection point a pressure to be built up on Erdogan, but that moment has not yet come. And I agree with Bilgehan's initial comment that really, if anyone is going to protest, it has to be Erdogan's base. Because the problem is Turkey having an authoritarian regime with limited arenas left for dissent. Whatever the opposition does, however way they criticize, they don't necessarily have the power to restrain Erdogan's moves as long as his base is behind him. Now, we know that AKP base is dwindling, right? So AKP is rapidly hemorrhaging votes, but Erdogan still commands 35 to 40% of the electoral share, which is still quite high given the current economic situation of the country. However, come this winter, with this ridiculous economic agenda that Erdogan's government is pushing, the inflation rate is going to go up. Turkey is not a rentier state, so it has to import gas and oil, which is going to further increase the inflation rate. Turkey is not located in a tropical part of the world, so heating costs in major cities like Istanbul and Ankara and some other Anatolian cities will be very high. And it's going to be more and more financially difficult for AKP voters to manage this winter. So I think come January or February, if Erdogan continues on this experiment, I think we will be at a very, very different position. Economically, at a much more disastrous position. But politically speaking, it's going to get very risky for Erdogan. And knowing the authoritarian leader in him, rather than conceding in domestic politics, he's probably going to step up pressure on dissent. And he will try to get some international support from whoever will give that support to him. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China. Erdogan is open for business with all of these authoritarian regimes. He will keep up the pressure on dissent. And we may be reaching a breaking point. Because these kind of personalistic authoritarian regimes, they survive if they maintain the economic situation, which Erdogan has failed to do so. If they retain sufficient diplomatic support, again, Erdogan has failed to do that. And if they remain somewhat flexible in domestic politics, so that they co-opt other actors and they don't necessarily wipe out the opposition. Now, Erdogan is going strong in all of these fronts. When I say strong, I don't mean it in a positive way. And we may be reaching a breaking point. Now, I cannot predict when that breaking point will come, January, February, March. But if the current trend continues, this is a disastrous course for Erdogan. And since he has completely sidelined all sorts of institutional checks and balances, including some members of his own inner coalition, right? The more sane people have been sidelined. There's really no break to this regime, right? So this is like a trunk coming down the road with no brakes, and it's going to hit, and it's going to hit the wall. Now, then things will get really ugly, and I suspect it's going to be early spring. Of course, beyond that, it's difficult to really predict. That's why the opposition needs to be vigilant, but also smart and responsible. Now, I'm not necessarily critical of people going out to the streets to criticize this regime, but I'm under no illusion that if the secular middle classes were to take to the streets, or if CHP, the main opposition party, were to protest this government, things are going to change. No, things will not change. It has to be the AKP base. And until they took up to the streets, or until labor unions call for a general strike, things will continue this way. But we are reaching a breaking point, and that is obviously dangerous for the Turkish election, but it's also very risky for Erdogan as well.
Özge, would you agree with that? A possible breaking point by the spring?
I could not agree more. I think Berk is describing a threshold for tolerance, right? One thing that perhaps the audience that are not very familiar with the Turkish society should understand, that it's a late industrialized nation we are talking about. So still there's a considerable share of the country that passed through the agrarian stage to industrialized stage rather recently, say, compared to countries like the UK or parts of Central Europe. Erdogan's government have this innate belief, invincible belief in the ability of people to be so resourceful that they will be able to tolerate some of the shocks that they're experiencing at the household level, right? So that they are testing it in bits and pieces, rather than dropping the interest rate altogether, maybe 3, 4, 5 points. They're doing it 1 point, 2 points at a time, basically. And this is a way of sort of testing the water. Where does this threshold lie, so to say? And there's going to be a lag, exactly the way Berk Hoca describes, to the extent that we have seen the inflation in October to be declared to be around 20%, which is something that we should take with a pinch of salt, obviously. That the reality suggests a much higher inflation rate. But for a second, let's assume that that's a true inflation number. None of that reflects what has been experienced over the past few weeks with the depreciation of lira yet. So that there is going to be a lag between what we observe in foreign currency and what is going to be felt at the household level in terms of their purchasing power. And that should be some months. But the way I see it at this point, that the vicious cycle we were so scared of has already begun. My personal fear is if people start withdrawing their money from the banks, and I knock on wood all the time when I even utter this out loud. I don't even like myself. I don't even like to hear myself considering this possibility, because then that would be a complete disaster. And we have seen some signs of it during the economic crisis we have had in 2018. So one thing that would be a quite disastrous situation is if that happens. And I hope that doesn't happen, obviously. But even then, the debt of the country is in a dire situation now. Nearly 60% of the total government debt is an FX component. And if the currency keeps depreciating the way it does, we're going to end up in a very difficult situation. And there's this implications for the households and household purchasing power that we will see in a few months, far better because of the lag, obviously, between depreciation and the price levels. And I cannot see a scenario where we can avoid having a snap election to that end, because I think the only thing that can actually cool off the market is the promise of a snap election. And right now they are very outspoken about the fact that they don't want it and there's not going to be a snap election, but soon enough, I think we will see them change their mind on this. That's my prediction.
It's getting gloomier and gloomier here, but I think that reflects where we are. We're into the last few minutes for our hour today. Although I'd like to say, first of all, will you both consider please coming back? Barack always knows he can come back. Please come back. I think we'll follow up on this. I know we're not, let me close by, I know we're not supposed to predict as analysts, but I can't resist this now. And that is two questions. The first is, from what you're seeing right now, and taking it a bit further from what you've just talked about, where do you see the Turkish economy 12 months from now? Berk?
Let me leave the Turkish economy part to Özge Hoca and focus on the political part, because I'm not an economist, and given the volatile situation, I don't find myself in a position to really predict, other than saying that Turkish lira will continue to plummet as long as the current course is continued. But in terms of Turkish politics, I think we are on the verge of some major dramatic changes. And I fall, we said that we've painted a gloomy picture. Let me at least try to add up a more optimistic side to it. Erdogan is on his way out. This is just a matter of time. It could be 6 months, it could be a year, it could be a year and a half, and it's going to be a very, very painful year or a year and a half, but this is it. He has come to power in 2002 in the immediate aftermath of 2001 economic crisis, with promises of bringing prosperity to the Turkish people, cleaning up Turkish politics, ending corruption. And basically, after almost 20 years in office, Erdogan has left a legacy that is far worse than, in any indicator you look at, far worse than where we were in 2002. The GDP per capita is much lower, the level of democracy, the level of rule of law, the strength of Turkish institutions, Turkish foreign policies, isolation, and so on and so forth. So we are really looking at a disastrous outcome. But at the same time, of course, Turkey has quite a strong tradition of institutions by developing country standards. Turkey has a fairly educated secular middle class, and we will come out of this crisis, and we will actually, I hope, become one of the first countries to defeat a populist autocrat through the ballot box, and that the Turkish model will be repeated in India, in Poland, in Brazil, in Hungary, and some other places. And then we will begin to talk about reinstitutionalization, rebuilding our country, rebuilding our economy. And as much as the situation is dire right now, I'm actually quite excited at the prospects of joining that fight in a year's time or in 2 years' time. Because as Özge Hoca mentioned, Turkey is a late industrializing country. And in fact, the Turkish society urbanized. Turkey reached 50% urbanization rate as late as, or as recent as late 1980s, right? So the electorate that brought Erdogan to power was still fairly rural or semi-rural, having only recently migrated to urban areas, and really in need of state assistance, in need of capturing cheap land in urban areas, finding low-income jobs that Erdogan's party provided since 1994 at the local level, since 2002 at the national level. That generation is on its way out, right? So this is not just Erdogan's career being over in terms of his political model collapsing, his generation is being over. His Cold War style of politics is being over as a new generation steps up. Now, this is the optimistic story that will start in a year's time or in 2 years' time. But until that, there will be a huge bill to pay. And I cannot predict really how extensive this bill will be, because it really comes down to when the early elections will be held. It could be in 2 months' time, it could be 6 months' time, it could be a year's time. So that's why, for me, it's a lot more important to focus on what the opposition does, right? The opposition needs to remain united. The opposition parties need to remain united so that they could establish a political alternative, so that they can give hope to the people. as a comparative political scientist, I follow Latin American politics as well. And I've seen a similar story. There are, of course, some differences, but I've seen a similar hopelessness story in Venezuela, where the economy crumbled as a result of the personalistic interventions of a populist autocrat. That was a left-wing populist experiment, which is actually in some ways far worse than a right-wing populist experiment. But there, the issue was the opposition was also divided and could not really give hope to the people. And the government lost, but so did the opposition. I think in Turkey, we are looking at a slightly different story. We haven't really touched upon that today, but many of the major metropolitan governments, metropolitan cities are run by the opposition, and they're run fairly effectively. So we're beginning to see some democratic spaces spring up under this electoral authoritarian regime. We're beginning to see some new political cadres come into place at the local level. We're beginning to see some interesting new policies being followed. And so as much as things will get ugly within the next year, beyond that, I think we have chances of rebuilding Turkey. And that's what I want to focus upon. We will soon end Erdogan chapter in Turkish politics. And hopefully we will be able to end political Islam chapter as well, because this disastrous policy does not just originate from Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but the people who supported him, which includes the Islamic base as well. And they need to share a lot of blame. So hopefully we will be approaching a secular era in Turkish politics. So let me end on a good note.
Thank you. From darkness comes the dawn. But before we completely welcome the dawn, let me go to Özge. And then my second question was, where do you see Erdogan in 12 months? So I'll combine it. Where do you see the economy, and where do you see Erdogan's position at this time next year?
It would pain me to spoil the optimistic spirit Berk Hoca has established here. I don't want to be the Grinch that stole the Christmas, basically. So I would very much like to believe the picture Berk is painting, actually. I've seen the type of solidarity that is very rare to come by in a political sphere over the past 12 months or so in Turkey, anywhere in the world, basically. Like the kind of people that sit around the same table and have conversations about the future of Turkey are not your usual allies. And the ability to establish a coalition as such originates from the fact that they now believe that it is achievable. That's the most important thing, right? That you have to believe that you can actually win. In order for you to sit at the table and start discussing, and people do believe that this can happen. So this is a very important aspect, and we also know that these rather quirky, bizarre economic experiments cannot last longer than they did. So we are, I think, at the end of a cycle to that end. That this level of tolerance, or this threshold tolerance that we were talking about, I think we reached a point where it cannot be pushed any further than it is pushed until now. But if you ask me what's going to happen to Turkish lira in 12 months, the only thing I can tell you is that, I mean, the only thing that is predictable about Turkish economy is that the unpredictability of Turkish economy will persist until the next election, I believe, or the promise of an election. So it's very difficult to actually make any predictions, since it has nothing to do with institutions. It has nothing to do with the central bank. It has nothing to do with the common sense you find in economic theory. It's one man, he can wake up tomorrow and feel like dropping the interest rate a couple more points, and there's no mechanism to stop that from happening other than civil unrest and civil disobedience, which is again something that I fear a bit. But I don't want to have this. I don't want to again spoil the optimistic spirit that Berk established. So I'm not going to continue with my horror stories right now.
Well,
I think
it is the Christmas season of cheer and goodwill. So I will hold on to a bit of the dawn as well. But for now, I think so many more questions. For example, will there be a foreign policy adventure as a distraction in the next 12 months? We will have a part 2 with you. We will invite you back. But again, for now, let me thank Berk Esen. Let me thank Özge Öner. Let me thank Bilgehan Özpek, who had to leave us for childcare a few minutes ago. This has been a wonderful start to a bit of our dawn out of the darkness, which is that for everything that you all might be facing out there, for all the tensions, for all the day-to-day issues that we have faced in the last couple of years and beyond, for all those autocrats out there, if we can keep talking, well, there's a bit of hope which is going. So let me also thank the great people at Dactylo 1984 for letting us put a bit of hope and a lot of discussion on the air today and in the future, because this is just the start of where we go next. And how do you find out about that? Well, you can go to Dactylo 1984's great website, or you can follow it on social media via Facebook, via Twitter. You can follow Deep Dive Politics on its Facebook page or under dive_politics on Twitter to watch and the latest video, the next podcast, our next snapshot, and of course, to make your own contributions. But for now, until we meet again, stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other. I'm Scott Lucas, and this has been Deep Dive Politics World Unfiltered in partnership with Dactylo 1984. Thanks again.